We begin tonight with the European Union's dissenter-in-chief paying a visit to Donald Trump at the White House. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has built his political identity on frequently standing opposed to other European leaders. He's been a vocal supporter of Donald Trump since his first presidential bid, and he has maintained ties to Russia's President Vladimir Putin, even when much of the world turned its back on him over the war in Ukraine. That has made him an outlier within the European Union, but it has cemented his relationship with the American president. And that affinity was on show at the White House when the pair were asked about Trump's efforts to end Putin's war.
I think that Viktor feels we're going to get that war ended in the not too distant future. Viktor, do you want to talk about that?
Well, I'm strongly convinced. So the question is whether we Westerners are unified or not. The problem is that the president has huge peace efforts, which are just splendid and very positive for the European continent and all the peoples of Europe. But at the same time, we are not unified because Brussels and the Europeans has a different approach to the war. So the only pro-peace government is the United States government and the small Hungary in Europe anyway. All the other governments prefer to continue the war because many of them think that Ukraine can win on the front line, which is a misunderstanding of the situation. So it's a complicated issue. We will discuss it. It requests not just 2 minutes to respond to your question, but rather than our lecture. Sorry, not to continue more than that.
To both of you.
So you would say that Ukraine cannot win that war?
You know, miracle can happen.
Yeah, that's right.
Zsuzsanna Végh joins us now. She's with the German Marshall Fund of the United States, where she focuses on Central and Eastern Europe. Zsuzsanna, welcome. Can Viktor Orban play any kind of serious role in helping end the war in Ukraine?
Thank you for having me. Well, he certainly tries to portray himself that he can be a mediator between the United States and Russia. But I believe these two parties do not need that sort of mediation. And the fact that the Hungarian governing party, since the start of the full-scale invasion, effectively vilified Ukraine and the Ukrainian government, it does not play an impartial role in this context either. So in short, I do not think that in substantial terms beyond the image, this role is justified.
We saw Orban there talking. He said Ukraine cannot win this war, essentially. And that was something that Trump really appeared to take on board. To what extent do you think it's likely that Orban will disrupt the efforts of other European leaders to get Trump to put more pressure on Russia?
Well, I think what we can expect is that the Hungarian government will continue its policy line as it has done over the past several years. And this line was definitely disruptive to both European unity and efforts to bring an end to the war or to support Ukraine. What we can expect here is that the energy sanctions that the U.S. has imposed now on Russia will be on the table, and the exemption that Prime Minister Orban is asking for would indeed weaken these sanctions and therefore would weaken the pressure that the United States is putting on Russia.
Orban is seen as one of the most pro-Russian leaders in the European Union. How does that affect his relationship with Donald Trump?
I believe it is not uncontentious. So besides Hungary's close relations with China, Hungary's energy dependence on Russia is another area where tension may be in the relationship between the Orban government and the Trump administration. I believe Prime Minister Orban seeks to frame this dependence on Russia, which actually, in fact, deepened since the start of the full-scale invasion, as a practical issue and he will be asking for some form of support to potentially diversify, but he will not be cutting these ties in the near future, I believe.
But it is not a practical issue, is it?
It is also a political strategic choice to deepen cooperation in the context of the full-scale invasion with the aggressor. So I do not think that this is simply a practical matter.
Budapest was the proposed venue for a second Putin-Trump meeting this year before it was canceled or maybe just postponed. It seemed today as if talks were again on the table. You say that the U.S. and Russia don't need Orban as a mediator. How then did Orban hope to capitalize from that meeting taking place on Hungarian soil?
That's right. I do not think that his mediation is needed here. The way he seeks to capitalize on this is in political terms. This would strengthen his image both domestically, especially if such a meeting could take place ahead of next year's parliamentary election, but also it could strengthen his positions within the European Union. And that is the type of gain that he is looking for here.
Orban likes to present himself as a very close ally of Donald Trump's. Is that how Trump himself views it as well?
I believe there is a political and maybe even personal affinity between the two, and also from the side of President Trump. I think the fact that Prime Minister Orban has been in power for over 15 years and has managed to centralize power in Hungary, strengthen his grip on the institutions at the expense of democratic processes and checks and balances, appeals to President Trump. So there is that affinity, but it is also clear that this is an uneven relationship, and Hungary cannot offer all too much to the Trump administration.
But you mentioned it, I'm sorry to jump in there, but Orban has, of course, been in the game longer than Donald Trump. Would you say that his leadership has served as some sort of inspiration or a blueprint for the MAGA movement?
In many ways, I think the MAGA movement could draw inspiration from the Hungarian case, and there have been strong ties between the Hungarian government and affiliated, connected organizations, think tanks on the Hungarian side, and organizations like the Heritage Foundation, which worked on Project 2025 in the United States. So the channels are active. There have been exchanges between the two parties. And indeed, we do see some measures implemented in the United States over the past 10 months that very much resonate with the Hungarian illiberal playbook.
Mm-hmm. Viktor Orban is up for re-election next year. Briefly before we go, what's riding on this election for both of them, for Orban and Trump?
For Trump, it would obviously be important to have an ideologically close ally in the European Union, but I believe that he's not particularly dependent on Prime Minister Orban's continued governance. The stakes are much higher, obviously, for the Hungarian Prime Minister. This is the first time that he, since 2010, that he faces a very strong, unified opposition that, in fact, just came into the picture a year and a half ago. This is the first time that actually the opposition party is leading in the polls. So he is in a hard place and it can potentially lose the election. So he will probably make sure and that he is strengthening his position beforehand.
We appreciate your insights. So is Zsuzsanna, Végh.
Thank you very much for having me.
Anna Grzymala-Busse is the director of the Europe Center at Stanford University in California. She joins me now. Good to have you with us. Now, we've seen Orban there saying he and Trump want peace and the rest of Europe just wants to prolong the war. What do you make of that?
You know, I think everyone wants peace. It's just that the understanding of what peace is very different. So for President Orban and I suspect President Trump, peace is capitulation. Basically, Russia getting whatever it wants and a return to the status quo. For most of Europe, however, peace means an active decision by Ukraine with full Ukrainian agency. And if Ukraine wants to fight, that is its prerogative. So there's a very different understanding here of what peace means, on what terms, and who would be the main player.
Speaking of players, how much influence do you think Orban has when it comes to how Trump deals with Ukraine and Russia?
You know, I think President Trump tends to listen to the last person that he's spoken to. And so I'm sure he's been influenced by what Prime Minister Orban has said. Whether that lasts beyond the next conversation is not clear. We've seen already several switches in U.S. policy towards Ukraine and towards Russia's role in that conflict.
Yeah, speaking of switches, I mean, the U.S. had been considering targeting Russia's energy sector was the main strategy, or at least the latest strategy to end the war in Ukraine. So with this turnaround, it appears, why would he give Hungary an exception?
Well, you know, I think the sanctions that the U.S. impose will continue. I don't think there's any question of that. But Orban is an ally of President Trump's, and Orban is in a really tough spot right now for two reasons. One, he's increasingly unpopular at home. In fact, what we see is that there's a new opposition movement. Its demonstrations are getting 12 times the supporters that he is. It's led by a very charismatic former ally of Orban's. And so politically, he's faltering. At the same time, the economy is really in a tight spot. It's very heavily dependent on Russian oil and gas. Something like the IMF estimates something like 74% dependence on gas and 86% dependence on Russian oil. And so if that were to stop flowing, that could lead to as much as a 4% cut in GDP. And that's something that Orban can't afford. So he knows that his one chance is Trump and an exemption to these sanctions so that Hungary can continue to be willfully dependent on Russian oil and gas.
And of course, considering their elections in the horizon, but also Trump and Orban have expressed the sympathy for each other in the past. Should we see this visit in terms of the US pressure campaign on Russia, or more of a favor between world leaders?
Yeah, I think this is very much a transactional meeting. Both Orban and President Trump tend to be relatively transactional and like to do business on a personal basis. And so I think this is much more sort of a favor done to an allied leader, a friend, than it is a shift in U.S. policy or any kind of a systematic rethinking of the U.S. approach towards either sanctions or towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Anna Grzymala-Busse, Director of the Europe Center at Stanford University. We appreciate your thoughts on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For more on this, I'm joined by Lane Scheppele, Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Princeton University. Good to have you with us. We've just seen Viktor Orban there saying it would take a miracle for Ukraine to win the war. And Donald Trump seemed in agreement. What's your take on that?
Well, Viktor Orban's been saying from the beginning of the war that Ukraine has no chance of winning. And sometimes Donald Trump has said the same thing. You know, the problem is for Orban that sometimes Donald Trump says something else. And we're currently in a phase when Trump seems to be supporting Ukraine more than Russia. So Orban did what he always does, which is he comes out with something that can be interpreted either way. You know, it would take a miracle, he says, that Ukraine could win, which doesn't mean that necessarily Ukraine would lose, which is what Orban normally says. And then Trump agrees with that. So it was Orban trying to have it both ways. And it was Trump, well, I guess also trying to have it both ways.
On that note, the White House says Donald Trump has given Hungary an exemption on buying Russian oil. Why do you think Trump did that?
Well, so Trump loves making deals, and he loves making deals for friends that he thinks are loyal. And so Orban has been defending Trump ever since Trump ran for office the first time. Orban has endorsed him. Then, Orban turned around. Trump turned around and endorsed them. They've been long allies on the international stage. And when Trump just imposed these secondary sanctions on countries that are buying Russian oil, Hungary is right there in the crosshairs, and it would raise prices of Russian oil right before Orban's election next year. So Orban needs desperately for that not to happen. And I think Trump is going to do whatever he can do to keep Orban in power. And that's why they gave an exception. By the way, I know you've just mentioned that the exception is for 1 year. The Hungarian press is reporting that it's indefinite. So it will be really interesting to see if there's any written agreement that actually spells out, what the agreement actually was.
And it's interesting that this follows the introduction of a resolution by 10 bipartisan U.S. senators just before this meeting, urging Hungary to stop buying Russian energy. How do you think Trump's decision then looks to Congress and also to NATO allies?
Well, this is an issue that has split the Republican Party in the U.S. Congress. There are quite a few Republicans who actually want to stand up to Russia and support Ukraine. And then there's a faction of the Republican Party in Congress that has stood behind Trump when Trump was supporting Russia. So this is an issue that divides the party. It would not be at all surprising, I think, to any of them if Orban was going to find some way to get Trump to make an exception. Because, Orban already has an exception from the sanctions that the EU has leveled on countries that still get a lot of their energy from Russia. So here's Orban trying to get the same favor from the U.S., and I guess he succeeded.
And you emphasized on the allyship between Trump and Orban. How much influence do you think Orban has when it comes to how Trump deals with Ukraine and Russia?
Well, Orban's people have been involved in Trump's policy circles for quite a long time. When Trump came to power in January, he came armed with this blueprint called Project 2025 that Orban's Project 2026, Project 2025. And Orban's people have been involved in writing that. So I would not be the slightest bit surprised to find out that some of Orban's people are also involved in a lot of the foreign policy discussions now that the U.S. government is having. So, Trump has kind of leaned on Orban's expertise to figure out how to consolidate power very quickly. And so in that sense, Trump owes something to Orban. But Orban demands, because he really needs, even more from Trump. Because Orban's in trouble now in Hungary. The economy is not doing well. He's been in power now for 15 years. Hungary's gone from being, one of the poorest countries in Europe to being the poorest country in Europe. And this is not a good track record. Orban's up for election, facing a very serious contender who's way ahead in the polls. And I would not be the slightest bit surprised if Orban got more favors. Again, here too, what the Hungarian press is reporting is that Orban was saying that Trump will guarantee some fiscal stability for Hungary. And my guess is that that means that Orban got more favors. He already also, by the way, just before the meeting, got the favor that Trump has now canceled the new Radio Free Europe Hungarian language service that was designed to get more truthful information into Orban's media bubble. So I think Orban accomplished a lot on this trip.
Okay. We appreciate your thoughts. Lane Scheppele, Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Princeton University. Thank you very much for speaking to us.
Thank you.